Dr. Salinas, thank you so much for joining us on Developing Classical Thinkers today. Could you give just a background, introduce yourself to our audience since you're new to the program, but you're an old friend of Thales Academy and the Calvin Coolidge Foundation, which is an institution that we've partnered with over the years to promote debate and civil discourse.
Yes, thank you, Winston. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. Indeed, I'm part of a project in Mexico City called Universidad de la Libertad, the University of Liberty, which is an entrepreneurship school. It's a school of entrepreneurship that promotes, as part of its fundamental part of its core program, the idea that you just mentioned, civil discourse, what it is to become a citizen, what it is to live in a society of ordered liberty, of an open society properly understood. And we see that as part and parcel, and a very important part of the formation of the entrepreneurial mindset. The idea of being able to learn from failure, the learning curve from failure, of why entrepreneurs engage in imagination, the critical role that it plays in innovation. And all of this depends in a very large measure in a society that protects individual liberty, that protects private property rights, and that allows people to be free, but also to recognize that that freedom comes with responsibility, and that there's a responsibility of not doing harm to others, as John Stuart Mill would say. So an essential part of this is conversation, what Michael Oakeshott calls civilized conversation. To be able to engage in conversation where where we don't have the hubris of the know-it-alls that are going to tell us exactly how to think and what to do and what to say, but and there's no preeminent narrative, or there's no domineering vocabulary within the conversation. So it's not physics, chemistry, and biology that dominate over poetry and music. We all have a voice in the conversation. And that I think is not just beautiful in its own right as far as an educational experience is concerned, but it is an absolutely fundamental feature of the type of business mentality that a thriving society, of an innovative society, of one that embraces technological change and progress, that this is part of.
And we're privileged to host you this weekend because you're speaking at the Calvin Coolidge debate tournaments. We hold these quarterly at our Luddy schools. So it's for all the St. Thomas More, Thales Academy, Franklin Academy, and other students who are interested in debate can come to one of our campuses and engage in this sort of civilized discourse, high-level, highbrow intellectual discourse on contemporary economic issues. And this weekend, we're talking all about tariffs. And so that was going to be the conversation for today's episode, talking through tariffs, like what they are, like why they're destructive to the economy, why they hinder freedom and prevent people from making the sorts of decisions that they have better information on, that they're better suited to make than some bureaucrat up in Washington. Could you give us just a high-level rundown of tariffs, what they are, and whether or not they will actually deliver on the economic benefits that we've been told that they're going to deliver on?
That's a hard question to answer because there's so much of a history and a story behind it. But tariffs, at the end of the day, are taxes. They're taxes that are imposed on goods that happen to be produced outside of the national territory. So outside of the U.S. borders, a tariff would be a tax, let's say, on an automobile imported from Mexico, on steel imported from Asia, on mangoes and avocados imported from Brazil and Ecuador, on iPhone components imported from China. These are tariffs, and they can be of a certain number, but at the end of the day, that's what they are. They're supposed to be a potential source of revenue, but what you're looking at when you have an increase in tariffs, really we should be more honest and call it an increase in taxes on stuff that U.S. consumers or consumers in different countries are buying, but they just happen to be made outside of that country.
And Bob, can you tell us what has the tariff atmosphere done just to your everyday, running Captive Air, Thales Academy? I mean, you're an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is basically someone who dodges the government. Like, what sorts of initiatives have you had to put in place in order to dodge all these extra taxes?
Well, components are sourced from around the world, but also machine tools. So, for example, in northern Italy, they make the best metal processing machine tools in the entire world. Mm-hmm. And by the way, they're the only people that actually make these machines. So we have to deal with inbound tariffs. If you look at components, whether they're German fans or various components from Mexico, from China, from Vietnam, all are tariff now. That means prices go up. So an interesting dynamic is Captive Air decided not to raise their prices in this environment, that we would pay for all the tariffs, which means we keep our Canadian customers. Mm-hmm. If we inflict the tariffs on our Canadian customers, we don't have those customers anymore, and probably permanently. In terms of public companies, they have to raise their prices because they have to meet quarterly earnings. As a private company, we have the prerogative saying we're not going to raise our prices. We'll absorb and lose half our profit for the year, but we'll gain market share and we'll gain confidence of our customers. The most important thing I think it does is it takes your engineering and management team full time to figure out how to deal with these tariffs. And also you could throw regulation in there also. So the idea of creativity and improving product is all on hold until such time as we can work through these really pretty horrific problems when you consider that most products made in America today or made anywhere are sourced worldwide for components.
And I think in general, President Trump states that the international, global market is geared against the United States, that other countries erect walls of tariffs that hinder American exports to those countries. Is that true at all? To what extent is that true? What is there some sort of ideological, real art of the deal sort of basis to imposing our own tariffs in hopes of bringing those countries to the bargaining table?
Well, there's three questions that you answered in that single question. Mm-hmm. One of them is what they call the long game of the Mar-a-Lago Accord is, do we need such a disruptive reset in order to bring people back on the table and negotiate a better, quote unquote, a fairer trade agreement with the United States? This was done in President Trump's first term with Mexico, when he had claimed that NAFTA was the worst trade deal in history, and so he brought Mexican and Canadian authorities to the table, and they renegotiated. And now it's called USMCA, which is it's the United States, Mexico, Canada trade agreement, Canada agreement. There's not even a mention of trade. So why is this reset and reciprocal tariffs on Mexico and 25% tariffs on automobiles and auto parts, but only those that are not exempt from USMCA? Part of what Bob Luddy was telling us right now, in economic jargon, would be called the enormous opportunity costs that are engaged now with the engineers, with the accountants, with everybody working in Captive Air that have to devote time. That's a distortion of the competitive advantage of Captive Air, but it's also a distortion with every single other industry and every single other enterprise that is engaging in the activity of buying and selling. That's basically it. You're responding to consumer demand independently of whether those components come from here, from there, or from elsewhere. And so the other part is of the question. So it's the Mar-a-Lago logic, the long game logic of bringing people back to the table to renegotiate what President Trump sees as a fair trade agreement. Then the other part is a more ideological component, which is the idea of balanced trade. The idea that we have to, that the deficits that the United States has, let's say with Mexico or with China or with Vietnam or others, means that Vietnam, Mexico, and China are stealing from the United States. And that's looking at the balance of payments as if it were a balance sheet in a company. And that's a completely mistaken way of viewing the balance of payments. At the end of the day, and this is a question as part of a conversation, right? But what is the purpose of trade? What is more important, to import or to export? So if I, as a politician, go out to the public sphere and say, well, I champion imports as the most important purpose of trade, I would be a laughingstock. I would be vilified in the press. But you know what? At the end of the day, the reason that the United States exports is to generate the revenue that consumers need in order to buy stuff not made at home. In other words, imports. Why would you produce something? At the end of the day, to produce is to generate savings, to generate revenue. Okay, but at the very end of the day, what does that imply? It implies consumption. Savings are deferred consumption. But that's not. In the 19th century, there was the idea of amassing gold, and that would make you rich. But gold, even then, was a medium of exchange. At the end of the day, what you want is to consume. That's it's to increase consumption, the availability of goods and services that is going to increase your livelihood and your well-being. And so, seeing from that point of view, the whole idea of balanced trade is shooting yourself in the foot. You actually have to engineer a recession, if not another great recession, in order to be able to attain that balanced trade. But this is something that, with all due respect, but people like Peter Navarro have, unfortunately, I think, done a great deal of intellectual harm to the idea and the whole purpose, the whole purpose of trade. If you don't lose any sleep at night, I think, and neither does Bob, if you thought about, for instance, the balance of trade between North Carolina and Texas, right? You don't care. You don't care. What if we take New York out of the equation of the balance of trade? And so now New York, because it's the financial capital of the world, we won't enter it into the whole calculation of the balance of trade. That means that everything the United States sells to New York would count as an export. And everything that New York buys from the rest of the world, all that it imports from the rest of the world, would not count as an import. So a lot of red ink, all of a sudden, a lot of red ink would be erased from the balance of payments. But nothing changes in the real economy. People are buying and selling. It's just an accounting trick. So it's I think it's a mirage to look at the idea that you have to have trade surpluses. Mexico's last trade surplus was in 1995. 1995 was the year after the peso devaluation, the so-called tequila crash, which generated a collapse of GDP, of growth, of about minus 9%. Okay? That's because nobody could buy stuff at home, so we had to sell it abroad. So, I mean, or think of it this way. In my immediate neighborhood, I have the equivalent of a 7-Eleven, and my favorite taco restaurant in Mexico City, and I have to go get a haircut every now and then, and go to the gym. I have 100% trade deficit with every one of those establishments. But I'm all the better for it, right? And how do I generate that deficit? By generating revenue, by engaging in work that either generates a savings or produces an income, right? And that's, in economic jargon, is called the capital account. So the deficit in the trade account is compensated with a surplus in the capital account. There's a lot of investment. Sometimes that capital account can be debt or can be fiscal deficits. That's bad. But what's bad is the debt and the fiscal deficits, not the fact that you're generating, if there's a new flood of investment coming in, that's also going to generate a trade deficit. So I think that it's very important to sort out all these different factors that are playing into the idea that tariffs are a bargaining tool, an effective, coercive bargaining tool to do a reset of the global order. I think they're far better measures to do that reset, which is necessary. The leveling the playing field. It's not fair, quote unquote, to compete with other countries that are subsidizing. Also, we don't like the fact that Canada is very protectionist in their dairy industry. Actually, that's harming Canadians more than anything. Or Mexican oil is another is another great example. In Mexico, the idea that the oil is ours and we have to be self-sufficient in oil. You try and be, anybody at Thales Academy, try and be self-sufficient for one day. I dare you to try and be self-sufficient. In fact, try and produce your own hamburger.
Yeah. Your quality of life goes down dramatically. Like, I can't make my own clothes. I want to wear Nikes. I don't want to make them. Like, that's the joke that's circulating around on the internet now, because the imports are typically luxury goods. So we send Japan paper, and they send us back television sets. That was the joke that Milton Friedman made.
Yeah, one follow-up question. The countries that have high tariffs are really harming themselves. We don't need to cause them any harm. They're harming themselves, their economy, their growth. So the idea we're going to punish them for not buying our product is ludicrous.
Well, it's almost, to continue with that, Bob, it's almost like saying, well, you know what? I'm going to shoot myself in the foot. And to reciprocate I forgot the term of when you engage in a tariff war, when they reciprocate with corresponding tariffs. It's like Mexico responding to the United States increase in tariffs. Well, you know what? I'm also going to shoot myself in the foot. And not only that, also in my kneecap. Oh, really? Well, now I'm going to amputate my leg. That's the.
How do you like that?
How do you like that? That's the. If you look at the economy as a body, as an economic body, that's what's happening. Now, of course, there's the heart and there's the brain and there's these very strategic parts where perhaps tariffs can be used as a measure to countervail practices of dumping or do countervailing duties or some such. But that's part and parcel of a larger trade agreement. Take the trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Today, Mexico. Bilateral trade between Mexico and the United States in maybe 3 years, 2 to 3 years, is going to reach $1 trillion in bilateral trade. Mm-hmm. I mean, I never, 30 years ago in my mind, when this started, when the NAFTA started, the North American Free Trade Accord started, in my mind I would think that Mexico would sell more to the United States than any other country in the world and would buy more. Mm-hmm. From the United States than any other country in the world. But that's not a particularity or an idiosyncrasy of Mexico and the United States. That's just people trading, because it's not countries that trade, it's people that are trading. You go to the border today, Nogales, Sonora, Nogales, Arizona, a Nogales citizen, they feel that they live in one city, that one part happens to be on one side of the border and the other part on the other side of the border. And if you go to the local Walmart, because there's Walmarts on both sides, there's taco stands on both sides, there's Burger Kings on both sides, it's going to depend on the exchange rate and where it's cheaper to buy it. Opportunity cost. Mm-hmm. The most important word in economics is or. Either you do one thing or you do the other. And those opportunity cost measures are what being enormously distorted by this whole new wave of tariffs.
Bob, do you think there's any justification to the argument of a balance of trade?
Oh, it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my lifetime. and the reference back to the states. So within states, we don't tabulate who sells what to whom. Mm-hmm. Some concepts that are put out might, to people, sound intuitively right until you think about them. And as you've expressed so beautifully, it's just people trading with each other. And Milton Friedman, this is 30 years ago, I just listened to one of his lectures, and he said, look, if other countries want to sell us products and technologies at a very low price, we should be buying them because we're going to be very rich because of it. So Trump has it exactly wrong. The U.S. is rich because other countries are producing for us. So here's a very good example. So the Vietnamese make $5,000 a year making Nikes, and an American would make an equivalent of about $50,000 a year. So their labor cost is 10% of ours, and as a result, we can enjoy these products at a very low price. If they came back to the U.S., and if we made everything in the U.S., first of all, our technology would be degraded seriously, and secondly, prices would be enormously high. So people really don't understand the complexity of manufacturing and the fact that it takes entrepreneurs and engineers to make these things happen. They don't, There's some kind of a fake belief in the U.S. that plants will just pop up now because we have tariffs. This will not happen. If anything, Captivir is considering maybe manufacturing in Mexico because the tariffs make components so high in the U.S., we become less competitive and we can't export. Mm-hmm. So countries that have no tariff, Singapore, Hong Kong for many, many years, Estonia, are going to be the richest countries in the world.
And they are.
And they are. they absolutely.
And I think, with Trump will regularly cite the administration of William McKinley, the tariff regime, that it was a time of unprecedented prosperity. Was it the tariffs that produced the prosperity, or was it the lack of a regulatory environment that allowed business owners and factory owners to produce? What really was the cause of that sort of prosperity? Because President Trump will regularly cite McKinley's administration and the tariff regime as further justification for enacting his own tariffs.
No, I think too that's got it completely wrong, mm-hmm. and we don't want to return to McKinley. We want to learn from McKinley. Mm-hmm. And in today's age, this whole idea that you're going to reshore manufacturing, well, you haven't been doing manufacturing because you might be incredibly good at it, mm-hmm. but you're so much better at services that it's much better for you to devote all your resources to services. It's, again, to use the simple analogy, the example that we use for comparative advantage in Mexico and Latin America is Lionel Messi. So the greatest soccer player that's ever lived also happens to be a remarkable gardener, mm-hmm. right? So on Sunday, he can go and play football for Inter de Miami, or he can fix his garden, mm-hmm. right? And his neighbor happens to be a fantastic gardener. Not as good as Messi, but a really good gardener. Mm-hmm. So what should Messi do? Fix his garden or go play soccer? Well, he should go play soccer because he's a fantastic gardener, but he's so much better at playing soccer than gardening that even though his neighbor, who does not as good gardening as he does, I'll hire my neighbor with the income that I earn from soccer, and I can earn more income and maybe even someday hire somebody as good as me for gardening. That's the whole purpose of trade, is you're depending on others, but it's a civilized dependence. Adam Smith understood this very well, and that's why and David Ricardo, David Hume as well, they understood this very well. And I think despite the debates between the founding fathers and Hamilton, I think they understood this very well. Well, let's translate the whole McKinley era into today's situation. Nobody talks, and certainly Donald Trump and Peter Navarro and his chairman of economic advisors do not talk about the fact that the United States, that its greatest competitive advantage today is human capital, mm-hmm. and technological development and services. And you know what? It has a $300 billion surplus in the balance of services, as should be expected, mm-hmm. because they're the best in the world at selling services, mm-hmm. which are far better paying jobs. People don't want to go back from services into manufacturing, no. right? You want to stay in services because that's what generates income. I would rather work 4 or 5 hours a day than 12, 14 hours a day, unless it's part of my leisure, right? But I'd rather have more leisure and libraries available to me, and if I have a higher paying job, which means I'm being much more productive. Productivity is the end of the game. Mm-hmm. You know more that that better than anybody,
yeah. I think that only 8% of Americans are in manufacturing. So if we said we're going to make everything in the world, the first question would come up with 4% unemployment, which is nominally considered to be full employment. Where are these people going to come from? Mm-hmm. And even where said people to be available, do they have the skills to know how to do this manufacturing, which is very complicated.
Yeah, it's so complicated and precise.
Yeah.
And that would drive up the cost.
Yeah.
Yes. Also, if you look back in the Industrial Revolution caused the boom, we are much more interconnected in 2025 than we were in 1890. Mm-hmm. And there's no comparison between these two things. And there were imports back at that time, so if anything, the imports restricted trade gave us a lower GDP than we would have had otherwise, and that's what is completely overlooked when they talk about McKinley.
I think it's an intellectual sleight of hand because like you mentioned, the small factories that are going to magically pop up like flowers after a rainstorm, like that's never going to happen because the government, the regulatory environment would prevent that from happening. as far as, labor costs, like actually putting up a plant. I mean, you know better than anybody just all of the hurdles you have to go through to set up a new factory, a new plant, like anywhere in the United States.
Even to build a simple warehouse in Pennsylvania or Florida, it's over a year, maybe a year and a half to get a permit to build a warehouse, okay? And then you build the warehouse, and then they have permits to put shelves inside the warehouse. You can't even erect a shelf inside your warehouse unless you have permission from the government. I'm sure in Mexico is a little bit more free market than that, and you can just put some shelves in your warehouse and stock things. So regulation, taxes, and tariffs, which are taxes, are a tremendous burden on the economy, and they make everybody poorer. And there's no dispute. If we go back to Adam Smith, why did the ancient Greeks build these boats, and why did they go around and trade? They figured it out 2,500 years ago. So there's nothing new here.
Mm-hmm. How did Trump calculate these tariffs? Because ChatGPT, like guaranteed.
That's a joke, but I actually believe that. And he's got some really smart people working for him. Kevin Hassett, Scott Bessent himself. But I think that was born out of the ideological, let us call it fetish, of balanced trade. So it's the idea: what do I export to Vietnam, and what's the trade deficit with Vietnam? Let's divide it in two, and that percentage, that's the reciprocal tariff that I'm going to apply. It's to be very frank, it's lunatic math. It's again the idea I'm reciprocating in order to have a balanced trade, and what you're doing is precisely that. You're hurting enterprises that depend on trade with those countries, in this case Vietnam, that either buy components from Vietnam or buy goods from Vietnam and also sell to Vietnam. A complete distortion of that. That's why Liberation Day, some people are calling it Obliteration Day.
I wanted to bring up another point. You said he has smart people working for him, and that's true. But aren't those smart people severely compromised? Because if they walked in and said, Trump, your idea on trade is completely ludicrous, they would be walking out the door fired at the same time. Yes. So we're seeing universally, whether they're senators, congressmen, economic advisors, commentators, all bow to Trump, the prince. Mm-hmm. And that's not how the system should work.
That's true.
You talked about civil discourse, debating these things. That is not happening at the current time. And I think people need to recognize this is when tyranny really takes hold.
Mm-hmm. If I may, I'd like to go on this because I think that's an extremely important point that Bob is making, is the very strong authoritarian dimension that these debates are having, which has become a signature of certain developments in 21st century politics, international politics. I'm from Latin America, and we've seen the emergence of highly illiberal populism. Not necessarily left or right. I don't like those brands. I think you're pro-freedom or against freedom. And it's a better way to couch those terms. But you have leaders today where it is not morally justified to question the word of the authority. Mm-hmm. Our former president in Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, saw himself as the representative of the nation, but also of the truth. Mm-hmm. So if you say something against him, automatically, not only are you saying something false, you're also committing treason, right?
Yeah,
it's against.
It's very Rousseauian, like the general will, like, hey, this is what the people have voted. This is what I'm carrying out. You can't question it.
I'm the incarnation, and unfortunately, I believe Donald Trump sees himself. I won with a popular mandate, and that bestows me with almighty powers to do whatever I want. In Argentina with Cristina Kirchner, fortunately, Milei was able to dethrone that myth. But in Venezuela, look at what could potentially be one of the 5 richest countries in the world, what Maduro and what that populist mentality has done. But it also happens in Europe, in Turkey, in Hungary with Viktor Orban. And this idea of the strong man or of the strong politician, and you cannot question whatever that person says. That comes with a very strong authoritarian streak, and is antithetical to the whole idea of engaging in a free and civilized exchange of ideas, a free trade of ideas. That's what civilized conversation and debate are at the end of the day. So I think that's a really important point.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in the 1830s and 40s, tariffs were like the most hotly debated issue in Congress. So people had the chance to weigh in on what the tariff rate was going to be and so on. And even the tariff of abominations, the way Martin Van Buren set it up, it benefited his political supporters in Pennsylvania, ironmongers in Pennsylvania, ironmongers in New York, and it ruined the textile manufacturers in New England because that was the hotbed of political opposition to him. That's where all the Federalists were. And he didn't need their political support, so he just left them out to dry. So here we've got one person just ruling, issuing tariffs, doubling them on whims. You have to get Truth Social if you want to stay abreast of where the tariffs are going at any given time.
And the uncertainty that generates. But the great benefit from a Mexican point of view, here's a country which has been the victim of authoritarianism most of its modern life, where it was what Octavio called the will of the prince, and the almighty president, and the idea of a political hegemony, that it all depends on what the president says is what goes. Well, that fortunately started to decline in 2000, but the whole idea of how these political structures allow the citizen to become a much more active voice. And it can become an active voice with freedom of expression, but also in trade, and also in empowering the citizen with the freedom to choose what he or she wants to buy, when he or she wants to buy it. And it doesn't matter if it comes from Mexico, if it's made in Mexico, or if it's made in China, or if it's made in the United States. At the end of the day, who cares as long as it increases my livelihood? As I get a better product at a cheaper price, that's the name of the game. That's the name of the game of good business. That would be really the art of the deal.
Calvin Coolidge described Herbert Hoover as a man with solutions looking for problems. And we ended up, he almost tripled the marginal income tax rate. He created Smoot-Hawley, and he even realized Smoot-Hawley was a little out of control, but since it was his idea, he signed the bill. Both contributing factors to the Great Depression. I think we're seeing a rerun with Trump of the exact same thing. He's got solutions looking for problems. There was no problem. If anything, if we declared unilateral free trade in the U.S., we would be so rich, half the people wouldn't be working, literally.
Let me get back to that point. In Mexico, when Mexico decided to begin embracing trade liberalization, they looked at the numbers and they said, well, 80% of my trade is with the United States. So I could unilaterally declare free trade, and that is the best of all possible worlds, is to simply unilaterally liberalize. However, if I unilaterally liberalize, somebody might come in the next 6-year term or in the next term and unilaterally deliberalize. So let's sign an agreement with rules of the game that are regional, that are not just national. They don't depend on the whim of that prince. To say, okay, so now I'm going to expropriate this concern, or I'm going to tax you out of existence, or what now? The regional rules of the game. So it's almost as if Mexico, what they did with trade, is if most of my trade is with the United States, let's make it permanent. Let's put a straitjacket on that. And that's what NAFTA has been. Well, that's what the North American Accord has been. And that's why you've seen such explosive growth and such explosive investment in those states in Mexico that are much more linked to the USMCA, much more linked to the North American Accord. And what Trump, with Truth Social and with waking up and the mood of the prince, and with the reciprocal tariffs, what he's done is destroyed that uncertainty. So who wants to erect a supply chain today in North America? You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't know if your costs are going to triple tomorrow, or they're going to double, or maybe they're going to decrease. But you have no certainty, reasonable certainty. These are 30-year investments. These are gargantuan financial exercises that depend on a reasonable estimate of how things are. If you don't know if your long term is 5 p.m. or is 7 a.m. tomorrow, there's very little chance of long-term investment occurring.
Is it possible that this idea of manufacturing in the U.S. will actually have a perverse effect, where nobody will want to invest in the U.S.? Because if high tariff exists, their component costs will be high. They won't be able to export. And their costs in the U.S. will be so high it'll restrain growth.
And you'll also have to look at what the reciprocal tariffs of countries like Canada or like China are. But indeed, you can't export just because of your cost basis here. And then you have to add the fact that now you're going to face a tariff abroad.
You're completely non-competitive.
You're completely non-competitive. So yes, I think you're right, Bob. It may well have the reshoring is going to go elsewhere. It's going to go to Mexico. It's going to go.
You think about it, if you produce in Mexico, you have lower tariffs, you have lower cost of inputs. Now you can export to South America, to anywhere in the world more competitively than the U.S. And for that reason alone, I don't know why anybody would build a plant in the U.S. to have very high costs and to be almost precluded from export, literally precluded.
It reminds me of an argument Murray Rothbard brought up in the Progressive Era. He's got this great history book in the Progressive Era, but he calls tariffs a means of enforcing the members of a cartel to, like, setting prices for members of the cartel, because every business within that cartel is very inclined to, undercut their competitors, or some new business enters the fray or whatnot. Is there something in this? The tariff regime as it's being set up, setting prices artificially high, since businesses in the United States, manufacturing in Michigan, the auto industry, that labor prices, the regulatory environment, it makes all of our manufactured products so much higher. So tariffs, we're going to use those as a means of setting the price artificially high, and that'll benefit like certain key constituents, unions that voted for President Trump, and so on. Do you think there's an argument for that? Like, what's ultimately going on is just we're trying to keep the prices high for a favored constituency group.
Yes, I think that's part of it, but I think you could do a stronger version too. Mm-hmm. What it's leading to is a whole wave of lobbying. Mm-hmm. And it's an enormous source of corruption, mm-hmm. because everybody's vying for a favor now, mm-hmm. an exemption. And when you talk about taxes, a tax exemption at the end of the day is financed by somebody else. In taxes, that is a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. So the benefit of one is the loss of the other. So somebody's paying for that. You may not know that it's the sales tax here or your income tax there. You don't know that it comes how much comes from your pocket, but part of it is coming from your pocket. And that is perverse, I think. It does lead to a whole series of now my advantage is to see what kind of exemption I'm going to get. Mm-hmm. That becomes the end game, instead of me focusing on where I can be more competitive or increasing my distribution possibilities or adapting a new technology. No. Let's hire a superstar lobbyist, mm-hmm. to. Well, it's part of what Bob mentioned, is regulation, right? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, tariffs as taxes are also part of that regulatory environment that asphyxiates entrepreneurship.
Yeah, think about this. So Apple got an exemption from the tariffs. Maybe they're paying 10%, but all the small businesses, or even some businesses that are large, have canceled their orders, and the very small businesses are going to go out of business over this. And it only takes months. So he can say, well, we're going to get this resolved this year. They're going to be out of business, gone, lost their jobs. And they're probably not going to come back because they're financial derelicts now, because they've been annihilated by the system. So back to your point, it's extremely unfair to the citizens, the entrepreneurs, and the people who are working to lose their jobs so that Apple can prosper because they have lobbyists. So this is a really important point of exactly what happened. It's 100% corruption 100% of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And the so-called mom and pop Main Street economy that you wanted to protect, that's the one you're decimating.
Because they don't have a place at the table. They don't have sharp elbows in order to get a better deal, some sort of exemption. They can't offer to build a new plant in Arizona to get, like NVIDIA, exempted from tariffs, also promised to build a new plant in the Southwest.
Can I bring another point? This is in the news today. So the $500 stroller from China, and most of them are made in China or Asia, is now $1,200. And so the average family can't afford $1,200. So by extension, whether they're going to say, well, maybe we shouldn't have any more babies anymore. We can't afford them. You know, daycare's too high. Everything that we buy, we can't afford. And if anything, we need more people, okay? This is also in the news today. People grow the economy. It's exactly opposite of all these silly people that think the more people, they won't be able to eat.
The population explosion.
Yeah, population explosion creates great GDP. Even the Chinese are going to run out of people as large as they are.
They're already in a demographic quandary.
Yeah, that's almost universal now. So everything you do to restrict the economy harms the economy long term, but it also harms those families, those individuals, those entrepreneurs. So severely that maybe they can't recover from it.
It just occurred to me that among these marvelous points that Bob is expressing, it's so important to think clearly about them. We know things are very emotional when it comes to national sovereignty, to self-sufficiency, to trade. Part of what Bob is saying is, look, instead of building walls to prevent immigration, we should be doing the exact opposite. We should be thinking of a sound regulatory environment where the United States is able to thrive on the basis of new immigrants. And immigrants, of course, we don't want to import criminals. But by the same token, you look at some studies that have been done, let's say Texas. 9 out of 10 violent crimes committed in Texas are committed by Texans. So should we build a wall around Texas to avoid those, to keep them inside and not having them go to other states in the United States? What you want, of course, is to punish those that do harm to others, right? Whether they're nationals or whether they're immigrants. And I think it's this with immigration and with trade. How with longevity today and with the decrease with the changes in the demographics of the economic demographics, at the end of the day, you're going to need, if you want to reshore, you're going to need people to come in. You're going to need engineers. You're going to need workers.
That's a really good point. Yeah. And we're going to keep those people out.
And now you want to keep those people out? I mean, so that's artificially driving the wages, but it's not determined by market forces. And remember, market forces are forces of those that are supplying things and those that are demanding things. It's not a graph of supply and demand. It's people engaging in real activities every single day, every second of the day.
That's the most salient point you've made. It's how we need to think of things.
Not in the aggregate, like not looking at gross national product and things like that, because the individual, like the business owner, the shopkeeper, the butcher, the baker, those people get lost in those sorts of economic calculations. And I think that's honestly the point of making the calculations like that. The averages get, you lose the people that actually stand to suffer from the policies.
There's containers stuck at the port right now because the freight forwarder doesn't know what tariff to charge. And they don't want to charge the wrong tariff because they'll be prosecuted. They'll be put in jail for making a mistake. So you just see one thing after another begins to degrade the economy. And if it happens to be tomatoes and they sit there for 3 weeks, what do you think happens? I mean, how absurd is this?
Or even think of my favorite example is again to mention the site of Nogales. Nogales is, I mean, not a very pretty town on both sides of the border, and certainly the Mexican side. But it's become an extremely important entry point of all kinds of goods. So on the eve of the Super Bowl, you have trucks that are lined, 3 kilometers perhaps, 5-hour waits, and this is in the fast lane, in the fast track lane, because they're carrying avocados. Why avocados? Because what do people do on the Super Bowl? They watch the Super Bowl, and what do they consume? They like their chips and their guacamole. and so this enormous spike in demand from avocados and also from beer, from Modelo beer and from Corona beer. Now, beer is exempt because it's part of USMCA, but not aluminum. So the aluminum that comes in the can, that has to face a tariff. And that's exactly the type of problem. What's going to happen with that guacamole that people like to consume on the eve of the during the Super Bowl? Are they going to have to pay 30%, 40% more for that guacamole. And once they do, that price is going to stay up there. It's never going to go back.
Right. Once consumers get used to it.
No. Once Walmart is selling you the avocado, they're not going to want to lower their price just because the tariff is out. So that's something called the stickiness of prices. But and there's a whole literature that debates this. But we have to look at this in terms of people. What are your incentives? Sure, if I'm doing customs, if I'm a customs officer and I don't know what tariff to pay, well, let the tomatoes or the avocados rot. Who cares? I'm not going to sacrifice my skin because it might cost me my job, or it might put me in jail, or I might have to suffer the wrath and full fury and anger of the Trump administration, or of the custom. The custom person in charge. Another great example about this is Texas. So I think, one of the states that is most suffering from this is Texas, especially in trade with Mexico. Texas sells more to Mexico than it does to the 49 states of the United States combined.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So
that's unbelievable.
SMU has done a project. The Cox School of Business did a project a few years ago, which I hope they update, called Texaco. Texaco, Texas, Mexico. That region alone is the 6th largest economy in the world.
And what goods? I mean, oil.
Everything. It's not a commodity based. Mm-hmm. It's an enormously diversified gamut of goods. And the United States they sell mostly human capital, and they sell services.
Is there an advantage to being on the border as far as promoting free trade, benefiting from that, like this particular study?
Yes and no. That's a great question. That's a great question. Yes and no, because on the border you tend to see all the bad things on the border, and unquestionably we have very bad things. I'm extraordinarily worried about the way that organized crime has gotten into the mix and failed regions in Mexico. I don't think Mexico is a failed state, but I think having let organized crime take hold and militarizing the police force, which is a tendency that's occurred in the past 10 years or so, has been a disastrous mistake. That's what you hear from what happens at the border and all the illegals crossing and this and that. But you don't hear about the enormous amount of goods that are crossing, and sometimes crossing the border several times. So auto parts. You have a Ford plant in Hermosillo, and then you have the Ford plant in Detroit, and you have the intellectual property offices in Windsor, Canada. And that goes back and forth several times. Why have a balance of trade? Why calculate a balance of trade? That's called a supply chain. Mm-hmm. Or why does Mexico calculate its oil deficit? We have a deficit with the United States. By the way, we want to make Mexico oil great again, and yet we import all refined products because it's much more competitive to have them refined in Houston. Mm-hmm. So we extract the crude, send it to Houston, where it gets refined, and we import all those, and we purchase those products because they're done in a far more efficient manner and in a cheaper manner for the Mexican consumer. And so, but we're all up in arms and that we want to attain oil self-sufficiency and make our own gasoline. And that led this is the counterpart of, this is what happens when you do these things, just to learn from Mexico. So this led the past administration to invest $24 billion, which are worth a lot more in Mexico than they are in the United States. $24 billion in a refinery that after 3 years that it's been built has not refined one single drop of gasoline. Why? Because it's more competitive to send it to Houston and send it back to Mexico. So why have a balance of trade in oil? Let's just call it that I'm sending you the raw material, you process it, you refine it, and you sell it back to me, and we're both happy. That's called the integration of a supply chain. And at the border, that is an amazing dynamic. Laredo and Nuevo Laredo are the two cities, I think it's the site in the entire world that has more economic activity. There's more economic activity in that border site than any other place in the world.
That's incredible.
So it's true that these politicians fundamentally don't remotely understand how the economy works, the interaction. One example under the Trump tariffs in 2018, slab coming from Indonesia to make stainless steel in Pittsburgh had a 25% tariff. It turned out in 2018 that the stainless market was very soft in the US. The stainless plant went out of business. As a result, now we have a shortage of stainless steel. So the price didn't go up 25%, it went up 60% from the 2020 or 2018 price. And that plant will never come back online. It was an older plant. They could survive in the market, but they're not going to reopen, ever. So we destroyed internal capacity so that we could have more manufacturing in the US. Now we have fewer stainless steel makers.
The government intervened to solve a problem that didn't exist, made the problem far worse, and now we have more government intervention in order to fix the problem that they created back in the first place. I mean,
Literally.
Hayek was right all the way down.
Every government intervention leads to more innovation. It never solves the problem, but does create new problems. Yeah, people have to know that.
Solutions looking for problems.
Herbert Hoover, and now Donald Trump.
Now, Calvin Coolidge was a protectionist, actually. And I think if there's an argument to be made for protectionism, which does not necessarily mean that you're going to apply tariffs, there's other ways that you can protect. He was very concerned about the erosion of daily economic activity. He was very suspicious of highbrow economists that came with their models and their theories and whatnot. You know, those Harvard types and those MIT types, they can stay in their classroom. But you know, I'm worried about the real men and women that are trying to make a living. And at Plymouth Notch, he was worried about the way that open competition would decimate, let's say, the dairy industry. Or sugar. So he was concerned about the fabric of community, of family, church, and local community. And now we may argue that he was wrong on his protectionism, but at least those were far better arguments for protectionism than some of these lunacies concerning balanced trade. He wasn't worried about balanced trade or about a number or about looking at a chart. He was worried about the effect that it had on his immediate community in Plymouth Notch.
But that seems to be more of the classical liberal position, in that the government is the greatest impediment to an individual's flourishing, their ability to make decisions day to day. Like, he wanted to keep the government planners out of the way of the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and the like.
Yeah. And the one person, the remarkable individual who was picked up on this is a former World Bank official called William Easterly. Bill Easterly has a beautiful book called The Tyranny of Experts. And he used to be one of those experts. And so they can't tell him, oh, it's not, you didn't study here and there. No, I did all that. I did all that. But I'm telling you, you have to let people be. You have to trust in people. It's trust in people, making their own decisions, learning from their mistakes, letting them relish in their own achievements. But it's people. And sure, we worried about our communities here in North Carolina. In Mexico, I worry about my immediate neighborhood and my immediate community. And others, well, in Vermont, at Plymouth Notch, we worry about our communities. But I think the most important principle would be to let them be. And in trade, that means let me trade with whomever I want. Because at the end of the day, when I engage in trade, the very idea of, if you think about the idea of trade, why would I trade something for something else? Whether I use money or whether it's barter, is because I'm benefiting. So Manuel Ayau, a great Guatemalan entrepreneur and economist, used to say that when trade is free and voluntary, 1 or 1 million or 1 billion party benefits only if the other party benefits. That's very strong. That's saying that that's a necessary condition for me to benefit is for you to benefit. That's trade. So managed trade is actually, I'll use a flashy word, an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, right? Because why? Because trade by definition, to engage in the activity of trade has to be free and has to be voluntary. And the only way I can gain is for you to gain. That's why Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and the great economic forefathers would say that it's a positive sum game, or that it's a win-win situation.